The study tonight is entitled Water into Wine, and it's set in John chapter 2, verse 1 to 11. Remember then from last week that the signs of Jesus, the miracles that he performed really, what we're looking at, are given that we may read them and believe that Jesus is the Son of God and have life, presumably the life of true sonship, which is his glory. So we saw that's the purpose of John's recording of the signs. It was the purpose of Jesus doing the signs, that we may see the sign and see through the sign to the glory of the Son, which will mean we'll see the glory of the Father, which will mean our heart will be confronted with a new revelation of how God is and who he is and how he operates. And then the heart says, I believe. I want to trust in this one. The signs of Jesus portray the power and the presence of God the Father for his people. One of the questions that I've got on the sheet there over the page, if you just turn to it on the bottom of that last page, question 9, somebody has suggested in a group that I was in recently that we may have Christologized the New Testament. By that they meant we've seen that everything begins and ends with Christ. That would actually be to go against Christ himself, for he said he came to reveal the Father and to take us to the Father. So that's what we mean when we say the signs that Jesus did, the miracles, portray the power and the presence of the Father for his people. They showed that Jesus was from God and not self-appointed, and they gave a taste of what was to come in the outworking of God's kingdom. Jesus said, remember, in John 14:12, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also, and greater works than these will he do, because I go to the Father." So the whole of the Father's mission to the world is in the hands of the Son, and he's giving it over to the disciples and then the apostles and then to the church, to us, and saying, my Father's going to be doing a huge work, a growing, extensive work throughout the rest of creation. John has the ministry of Jesus beginning with this sign. It was the first miracle, according to John, that Jesus did. It heralds the end of the old and the breaking into the world of something extraordinarily new, strong and effusive, that is, liberal and overflowing. Israel, and in turn all humanity, lay in a helpless old condition that only Father's Messiah, that is Jesus of Nazareth, could turn around. So as with all the signs, there is a strong element of judgment upon the old, worn-out and perverted systems of man's religion. This, as demonstrated in the case of Israel, could not simply be revived, that is, their religion. It must be resurrected from the death in which it was held. That's the great tragedy that Jesus found himself in, that God had given himself covenantally, that is, unconditionally, by grace to Israel, all of its life, given them himself through the law and the prophets and so on, and they turned it into something dead. That thing that they turned it into couldn't just be given an injection, adrenaline, to get the heart going again, because the heart had stopped. There wasn't any heart, there wasn't any joy, as we'll see. So it had to be resurrected. So that was the great confrontation. As Jesus comes and does his sign saying, this is the way my Father is, everything about that showed up everything that Israel wasn't. And the rest of the world, not just Israel. Without drawing too long a bow, you understand that, what we mean by that? Without stretching things too much, John has been careful to set out the diary of events leading to this first sign. The sign occurred 7 days after the beginning narrative, when John the Baptist was quizzed about his identity. You remember, in the opening of John goes through to verse 18, that's the kind of opening section, and then John the Baptist is introduced. From that point on, John is specific to say that there were 7 days that the sign of the wedding at Cana, the water into wine, occurred 7 days after the beginning. This may be John connecting the first miracle of Jesus with the whole idea of a new creation, the 7 days of creation. He's already opened his gospel with a reference to the first creation. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The wedding, let's get into the impact of the whole thing. Wedding celebrations often lasted for a week, if not more, in the culture of those days. So the welfare of the bride and the wedding party demanded careful planning and attention. You just couldn't hire a hotel, get them to do their stuff, and you walk in, walk out, that's the reception over with, then you go on honeymoon. They didn't have a honeymoon as such, but the week after their marriage celebration, their ceremony, they went to live in their home, their new home, and that was open house for the week. So he had all the rallies there for the first week. That was, in our culture, we'd think, well, that is a bit of a bummer. After the wedding ceremony, the bridal couple were escorted via the longest way around the village to their new home. That is, to show the community their joy in coming together. They didn't have a honeymoon as we know it, but for many days had an open home for all their friends and family. During that time, they were feted as a king and queen, with their word being law in their home. So it was a great time of honouring and celebration. No indication is given as to who the married couple were. There's conjecture in extra biblical writings that it was actually John's wedding, but there's certainly no indication, and you'd have thought John would have said. But anyway, a lot of conjecture about what John writes, and that's one of them. It does appear that Mary, that is the mother of Jesus, was well known, for she felt free to command the servants. You remember in verse 5, after she told Jesus that they didn't have any wine, and he'd replied, and then she said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. Jesus and his disciples had been invited. From the beginning, the Lord was connected with people in the ebb and flow of daily life. This is a very important part of the revelation of his Father. The current leaders of the day in the religion of Israel that had died and whatever, their whole idea of holiness was withdrawal. Christ comes as the Father's ambassador, and participation is the way he operates. And he did that, as we'll read on in the next sentence, freely. In other words, he didn't do it as a means to an end. He did it because that's how the Father is. And so that's how he is. It's a pain, isn't it, when you know that somebody's doing something for you as a means to getting you to their end, even if that's a good end. But Jesus had a freedom about him, and therefore the people that he went with felt free in his company, and not under kind of, I wonder what he's going to ask me to do. So the Lord was connected with the people in the daily round of life. Started with a wedding. His was, in other words, he'd scheduled the whole week just to be with people without thinking it was a waste of time. His love was one that participates with us freely. unlike the religious leaders of his day, he didn't withdraw from life but entered into it, and there engaged in the conflict for the hearts and love of the people who were subject to the evil one. So that's the first miracle. The first sign is a kind of embryo of how the ministry is going to be. And this is one of the first things we see, that the ministry of the Father so long had been shielded from Israel by the false leaders. Now the true Son comes, and they discover that God is immanent and with them, and delights in sharing in marriage ceremonies with them. The shame of no wine. John, the whole story is just a kind of punchy one, isn't it? John doesn't go into great lengths, and so he just says the wine ran out. Doesn't tell us why. There's an old rabbinical saying that says, without wine there's no joy. The psalmist said something similar when he said, wine makes man's heart glad. I don't think they meant that without wine everybody remained sober and so didn't have any fun. He's not saying that. Because it was quite an offence in Israel to be drunken. There was wine and then there was strong drink. Strong drink was the kind of undiluted wine. They diluted their wine by about 30%. So it was still had a punch, but it didn't knock you over. Unless you had a huge amount of it. They didn't mean that, that they had to get drunk to have fun. Wine was a staple part of their table fellowship. Not to have wine to offer would have been an insult to the guests. Why the wine failed, we're not told. Whatever the reason, the Father had his plans for this eventuality. We could apply the words later spoken by Jesus to this event as well. You remember when he was at the bedside of the person that had died, and he said, this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God. Well, we could rewrite that verse and say, this problem of no wine was not to end in shame for the bridegroom, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God, that is the Father's true bridegroom, may be glorified by it. That Mary was the one to take up the issue, and what her expectations of Jesus were have long been debated. It may simply be that Joseph had died, was no longer with them, and that she was accustomed to simply looking to Jesus for help. Likewise, our Lord's reply to his mum puzzles some. Woman, what have I to do with you? My hour has not yet come. It's kind of strong, isn't it? And it's rightly understood that way. It was strong. It wasn't rude. It wasn't cold. We note that the Lord's replies to people often move the conversation onto another level. Now, I've given you a whole bunch of references there for you to check that out. But it's often the case that somebody will say something to him, and his reply will seemingly, in the initial stages, be not what you'd expect him to say. Not that his replies were simply spiritual. In other words, he wasn't just taking it up to a different level to show everybody that he was spiritual, but rather that they related to the purpose of the Father in his actions and his teaching. So here's Mary with an agenda. Whatever it was, we mustn't conjecture. She simply said they've run out of wine. And Jesus is seeing a bigger picture. And so his reply to her comes out of that bigger picture, not just out of being her son. Jesus addressed his mother impersonally. Woman is an impersonal address. Didn't say mother. But not with coldness. He used the same word from the cross. You remember when he said to John, John, behold your mother. Woman, behold your son. The implication was that he could not just do what his mother wished, but was first about his Father's business. We get that from his reference to my hour. Suddenly that comes in from outside, out of the cold, as it were. My hour has not yet come. His hour was primarily the hour of the cross, and there's a whole stack of references there leading you through his ministry to see that that was what was in his mind. His hour on the cross would be the Father's great hour of holy love revealed, according to 17:1. So the mild rebuke of his mother was a reminder that his family connections were first and foremost with the Father. Did that mean he didn't honour his mother? No, he honoured his mum. But he had an agenda that was far bigger than just being a family, a human family. As the Father's Redeemer, he was the mediator for humanity's welfare, not just for hers. This would mean that Mary could be free from imposing herself on his ministry. You can kind of feel something there, can't you? Here's a mum that's really concerned. She knows her son is God's son. So it would have been very easy for her to become the kind of waver of the flag for Jesus. It would have messed things up entirely. So it was her opportunity now to actually move focus and see him truly as her son, but also as her Lord. That finishes up with her at Pentecost, crying out with the rest of them, receiving the same Spirit. Reflecting her heart for God's way, Mary made no protest. Mary was a beautiful woman, simple in faith. And you could kind of think, well, maybe this would raise the hackles and she could take Jesus aside and say, well, you've got no right to speak to me, play the poor me bit. But Mary doesn't do that. She made no protest. So for those who impose sentimental interpretation on Jesus' reply and brand him uncaring, should go to Mary and listen to her response. If she didn't find it offensive, then we shouldn't. This little exchange with Mary helps us to see that we must move from sentimentality to simple faith. There's a whole world of difference there. A sentimental approach to God will have us creating God in the image that suits our sentiment. A very dangerous thing, because he'll end up like we want him to end up, but he won't be anything like he truly is, and therefore he will be irrelevant to us. So Mary's exchange with him helps us to move away from that to simple faith, as expressed in Mary's final words in the whole situation. Do what he says, she said to the servants. The transition in our Lord's mind between his hour being not yet, as he's expressed to his mother, and then later on being now, is interesting. You can check this out and make whatever you will out of it. But after the Greeks, or up until the time when the Greeks came, or the Gentiles came seeking him in chapter 12, verse 20, and just before the celebration of the Passover, he spoke about his hour as being not yet. But there came a specific point, at that point, after the Greeks came and the beginning of the Passover, he then turns and begins to announce that his hour had come. So he's entering into the hour destined for him by the Father and by his own desire. The entire Gospel of John is a series of steps to the cross, resurrection and ascension. The signs on the way all lead us to the nature of what the Father would do for the whole world in those events. Water but not wine. Israel's religion had been reduced to a formal, fatherless, outward duty. So how are we? Are we formal with God? Would that be because we have no experience of the love of the Father, the glory of his gifts, and so any ministry to him would be just a duty? So we mustn't look at Israel as if somehow they were outside of any pressure that we would be under. There was no wine for Israel in her life, no joy, no delight. That's why the writer of the Scriptures says, amazingly, that when Christ came amongst us, there was nobody around that had joy like him. That wasn't just because it was good for him to be happy and put God in a good light because he was never grumpy. Suddenly, here was the true man, the true human being, reflecting how all human beings could live and be full of the delight of God and the Father and full of the joy of the Spirit. And he found that in a world where the Father had just impressed his love for so many millennia, and yet the people had turned out dull and dry and barren. Israel's shame was great because she'd been the recipient of all the Father's love and grace. And now finally she'd been given his beloved. But everything he did for her, she turned into water. The 6 water pots all up contained about 500 to 700 litres. There's a lot of water, kind of a rainwater tank, small rainwater tank. They were used for ceremonial cleansing and washings required by the guests at the wedding. Now, this was a big thing in Israel. As we see in a minute, it had been given to her as a gift of grace, but she turned it into a means of getting grace. If I wash my hands, if I wash my feet, then I'll be clean. Jesus said it doesn't work that way. It's what comes out that's polluting. It's not the dust on the outside. So on entry, their feet would have all been washed. So through the week, that's a lot of water. And then their hands were washed before all meals and then between courses, as well as many of the utensils had to be washed between use and all of the rest of it. External purification had been given Israel as a mercy, but they turned it into a way of getting mercy. This was still a hot issue, as John shows in chapter 3, verse 25. You can go and look at that and see how it was raised as a discussion point later, not so far down the track. For all those wanting to turn religion into their glory road. Now, if you don't understand that statement, and you won't just as it's written there, just go back to the last study. Essentially what we were saying is that man, outside of responding to the love of God, says, I'm pretty special and I will make my way to God the way I choose. Of course, it's an impossibility, because being dead in sin, the way that he makes is not towards God but away from God. But he sets out on this glorious road of religion. Do this, do that, don't do this, and God will be so happy that he'll fall about to be a friend of yours. So that essentially is what we talk about the glory road. It's inglorious really. It's only glorious in the mind of the doer, but it's in the light of reality, it's inglorious because it leads further away. For all those wanting to turn religion into their glory road, it's far easier to deal with inert water than feisty wine. Do you understand what we're saying there? If you're going to fashion a religion, then you need something you can fashion. So you'll bring into that things that you think you can control. This may manifest in the church as keeping things in order, or an avoidance of submitting to the ministry of the Holy Spirit, or of keeping faith within a kind of little cultural comfortable group. At its root, it's a refusal of the presence of the King, who was on his mission, not ours, you see. John had declared in chapter 1, verse 16, that there was a feisty new fullness in the person and faith of Jesus. The life of faith seen there was over the top, not inert and predictable. John says, for of his fullness we've all received grace upon grace, kept flooding over. Any of you have been surfing and you end up in the drop zone? You know what the drop zone is? The drop zone is where the waves break on you. You don't want to end up there, particularly if they're a big surf. And you end up in the drop zone, and so the next 40 Olympic swimming pools land on your head. And John says, that's how we found Jesus. Just get up from the last lot of grace and whoosh, you're covered again. Now the analogy falls down there, because if you stay in the drop zone of a big surf, you die. But you get the drift, I hope. Jesus said, fill the water pots with water. So they filled them to the brim. In the first instance, this must have appeared a strange command. Here they were out of wine, and Jesus seems to be getting more water for purification rites. I guess that's how they'd have computed it. They wouldn't have thought, this is going to be a miracle here. They're thinking, we're out of wine and he wants us to do this. There's a kind of, hiddenness. Once the water was turned into wine, I guess the whole party knew about it, but there's not much fanfare going on in all of this. Jesus didn't say, now, it's going to be good, go and fill them up, and will you see something? There's going to be a miracle here tonight. It wasn't that kind of approach. They were out of wine and he was telling them to fill the water barrels. Imagine their amazement when their actions were included in the transformation of water to wine. Not only was the wine good, but it was better than the previously one offered, which was a reversal of the custom we read in verse 10. Something effusive, totally new, beautiful, and totally appropriate to the need is revealed in the miracle. Something beautiful. Here's God in touch with the embarrassment of a bridegroom in Cana. It's beautiful because God acts in a way that just floods the whole wedding with an awareness of something greater than the next drink of wine. And it's totally appropriate. There's nothing out of joint. The sudden and excruciating shame of their winelessness had disappeared totally with the freely provided bottomless well of new wine. Probably had half the village there lined up with their jugs. The miracle of Jesus fitted seamlessly into the wedding banquet. He made no dramatic pronouncement, drew no attention to the actual miracle itself. Didn't have to really, I guess. The object in the first place was to remove the shame upon the bridegroom and to enable the wedding banquet to conclude in joy. The bridegroom was the guy suffering 1,000 deaths here. It was his responsibility. But there was a prodigality, a kind of over-the-topness about the wine provided. No wedding party could ever drink all that wine, especially when we realise the custom was to dilute the stuff by at least up to 30%. And John says, we saw his glory. Interestingly, the disciples saw through the sign to the glory of the Father, or the Father's King in the first instance. They read the sign, seeing a manifestation of Christ's glory. Just didn't see a miracle. They saw that it meant something about this man and what he was saying to them. We see that for John, the revelation of Christ's glory is the revelation of the only begotten of the Father. Back in chapter 1, verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, and we saw his glory. Glory is the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So the glory is the glory of the Father. That's what they're seeing. Something glorious about the Son's action led John and the other disciples to see through it to the glory of the Father. This was the wine that they so desperately needed to see the glory of the Father. Only this wine could end their shame. Their response must have so gladdened the heart of Jesus. He'd come for this very purpose, to reveal the Father. Faith began to bud. So if the disciples at the wedding of Cana had simply said, wow, what a miracle, what a man, and gone out and said, come and see the guy who can change water into wine. No, they saw through all of that to something more glorious than that. So John says, this beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Faith is never a leap into the dark, but a response of the heart to the truth of God revealed. That's a very significant and important part of John's whole experience. See, the Father doesn't, as it were, stand at the bottom of a big black hole, and we're kind of up on the rim, and he says, I'm down here. If you jump, I'll catch you. That's not the faith that John's being confronted with. Quite the reverse. It's the Father coming out of what they didn't know about him, out of the blackness, and through the sign that Jesus did, standing there in full and glorious beauty. And John says, we saw him and our heart leapt and said, we want to trust in this Father. This beginning, John says, of his signs, the first one, Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. John has many more to tell, but this first sign has something of the embryo of all Christ would be doing and how he would be doing it. It heralds a whole new kingdom, that is, a whole new way of rule and power of God breaking into sinful man's world. So do we finish just quickly looking at that last section, water into wine, a sign to be read. As with the parables, we must resist the urge to find something theologically significant behind every word. How many at the wedding read the sign, we're not told. From John's comment, probably not many. So we must remember that the signs of Jesus do not compel or automatically produce faith. Having said that, we understand from our Lord's own words to his mother that his agenda at the wedding was different to hers. So there's something more going on here than perhaps the first reading would allow. Several elements of the glory revealed point to the full picture to be revealed in and after the passion and the ascension. In other words, this is all leading to the great glory of the cross and the resurrection and the ascension, and we're getting pictures as we go. So what are some of those elements? I've just pulled out 4 that I think are valid. The old system of man's glory road religions are all out of wine. They're pooped, as a friend of mine would say. This miracle is a strong judgment, first on Israel and then on the nations, as they seek to squeeze unobtainable wine from their idols. So that's what's fronting them. Here they are at the wedding, no wine, only shame, and it's a whole parable in that sense of what Christ is finding in the world. It's going to get worse everywhere he goes. That's how it's going to be. A whole humanity without the wine of God coursing in their vein. Secondly, the glory is that the Father intervenes at the point of our greatest shame. So Jesus is going to meet many people in the next months, in the next years of his ministry, who are in the depths of great shame and degradation. And they're all going to discover God meets them there, with a view to lifting them out of that. So this first sign is a kind of explanation of how it's going to be. The Father's going to be always intervening. My Father is at work and so I work, Jesus said. So he's always intervening at the point of our greatest shame, seamlessly in his beloved, who in our flesh and by his shed blood, that is the true wine of God, he executes the wondrous exchange of our shame for his glorious sonship. Christ as true bridegroom, thirdly, will provide all that's required for the heavenly marriage feast, and that with prodigality. So he's not like the bridegroom that he saved. He comes with all of the wealth of the Father, saying, Father, this has been our plan. We're going towards a marriage feast. And the people that you give me, I'm going to bring to that marriage feast. And I've got all the resources to do that. And when that marriage feast is consummated, we're not going to run out of wine. And so all of his ministry is looking towards that great marriage feast that lasts for eternity, not just a week. And lastly, those at Christ's banquet, as he comes to them in his ministry through Galilee and Judea, they discover something immediately, and that is that they're always surprised by joy and delight in what their bridegroom gives them. And this is a foretaste, you see, which gives them their passion to have a future with him. Now, there may be many other things, other aspects